Welcome back to Space Curiosities. Last week, we took a brief look at the history of NASA, introducing some of the topics for future videos. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the space race between the United States and Soviet Union. In a battle for space supremacy between the Soviet Union and the United States, where do you think we should begin our journey? The United States? The Soviet Union? Well, if you were thinking Nazi Germany in the 1940s, you're actually right. I know, it's a curveball. The origin of the space race has its ties to World War II, where Nazi rocket engineers were building and testing ballistic missiles that were capable of suborbital flight. Put simply, these missiles were meant to be launched into space, but were not powerful enough to complete an orbit around the Earth. The scientists and engineers working on these advanced projects were actually service members of the Nazi SS, including Major General Walter Dornberger and a young engineering prodigy that we'll come back to, Major Wernher von Braun. These two men and their team of engineers were responsible for the development of ballistic missiles at the Peenemünde Army Rocket Center located in northern Germany during World War II. While at Peenemünde, the engineers developed the V-2 Vengeance weapon, which became the first vehicle ever to reach outer space during its test flight program between 1942 and 1943. Upon a successful launch to space, Dornberger spoke to the workers at Peenemünde saying, "This, the 3rd of October, 1942, is the first of a new era in transportation, that of space travel." During its service time with the German military, the V-2 was capable of some pretty fantastic feats. It was capable of reaching supersonic flight over Mach 4.5, travel over 200 kilometers, and it had the ability to deliver a 1,000 kilogram explosive payload. I think it's safe to say, but the Germans knew what they were doing with their rocket technology at the time, and no other nation could compete. As World War II came to a close, the winning nations began to realize the scientific knowledge that the Germans possessed. Because of this, the United States and Soviet Union each launched operations to move German scientists into advanced weapons programs into their countries. Of the scientists brought back to the United States, Wernher von Braun and Walter Dornberger were the highest profile. It just goes to show what competing nations were willing to do for technological advancements after World War II. Some of the scientists were tried in Nuremberg for war crimes that they should have been severely punished for, yet the Soviets and the Americans gave full pardons in exchange for scientific and engineering knowledge. Shortly after World War II in 1947, the United States and Soviet Union started building tension towards each other, leading to the start of the Cold War. This arms race between the world's superpowers at the time lasted from 1947 all the way till the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. During the early stages of the Cold War, Sergei Korolev, a Soviet rocket engineer, was given approval to begin development on a new and improved version of the German ballistic missiles. His development, the R-7 Semyorka rocket, was successfully tested on August 21, 1957, becoming the first Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile. The R-7 would later become a launch vehicle for Soviet-controlled spacecraft, and later iterations would send piloted missions. On the United States side, intercontinental ballistic missile testing began in 1945, but the program was canceled in 1947 after only partially successful tests. After recruiting German scientists, the United States Air Force reopened the idea of testing intercontinental ballistic missiles under the advisement of Wernher von Braun. Under his supervision, the MX-1593 project developed into a fully functioning American intercontinental ballistic missile on June 11, 1957, just 2 months before the Soviets accomplished the same feat. Further iterations of this program led to the development of the Atlas D rocket, which would become an important resource in launching objects into space for the Americans. At this point, both the Soviet Union and the United States control ballistic missiles that have the ability to launch to space. With this ability, each nation announced their plan to launch artificial satellites into orbit around the Earth. With growing concern over sovereign airspace violation, President Eisenhower took caution into launching a spacecraft over the Soviet Union. With this fear, President Eisenhower enlisted the Naval Research Laboratory to test a rocket that would not be used for military applications. To this notion, Project Vanguard was developed to test this intended launch vehicle with the goal of launching the first satellite into orbit. As part of routine testing, on September 20, 1956, Von Braun and his team of engineers successfully tested a Jupiter-C rocket that would be the launch vehicle for Project Vanguard. This test confirmed that the launch vehicle was sufficient to send a satellite into orbit around the Earth, but the test was scaled back only to test suborbital launch and re-entry of the test vehicle. Upon hearing of this test, Sergei Korolev believed that this was a failed attempt to place a satellite into orbit, causing the Soviet Union to accelerate its plans to launch a satellite. Because of this, Korolev's original plan was scaled back significantly in order to achieve the first launch into orbit. The new satellite would contain 2 radio transmitters, a pressure sensor to detect if a meteorite ever impacted the craft, and an instrument to detect the density of Earth's thermosphere. This satellite would become known as Sputnik 1, and it would be launched on Korolev's own R-7 rocket. At 10:28 p.m. Moscow time on October 4th, 1957, Sputnik 1 was launched, becoming the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. As a response to the launch of Sputnik 1, President Eisenhower pushed for the launch date of Project Vanguard to be moved up to December 6, 1957. This proved to be a massive failure, because just a few seconds after launch, the rocket exploded, destroying the satellite. This incident was seen as an international embarrassment, and the United States would need to regroup from this catastrophic failure. With the aid of the Army's Ballistic Missile Agency, the United States launched the Explorer 1 satellite on January 31st, 1958. Explorer 1 became the first American satellite, while also becoming the first spacecraft to measure the Van Allen radiation belts. As a result of this successful launch, President Eisenhower signed into act the National Aeronautics and Space Act, establishing NASA. On October 21st, 1959, NASA would then take over the remaining space-related activities controlled by the United States Army. With both the United States and Soviet Union having successfully launched an object into orbit around the Earth, the race was now on to send the first human to space. The United States began working on Project Mercury with the ultimate goal of sending the first human into space. Unfortunately, with the long preparation time for a Project Mercury launch, the Soviet Union passed the United States, reaching this feat first. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first person to be launched into space. His mission had him orbit the Earth for 108 minutes before returning safely. This became a monumental point in human history, marking the dawn of the space age. With Project Mercury being beaten by the Soviets, it was time for NASA to accomplish the same feat. Candidates for this inaugural flight were limited to test pilots from the Navy, Air Force, and Marines, with Alan Shepard ultimately winning the competition to become the first astronaut. On May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard was launched into space aboard the Mercury Redstone 3 launch vehicle, establishing him as the first American in space. After successfully launching humans into space, both the United States and Soviet Union needed to take the next step forward. This included landing the first manned spacecraft on another planetary body. In his now infamous speech, President John F. Kennedy stated,
"We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard."
This iconic speech rallied the United States, funneling new excitement into space exploration. This excitement led to the Apollo program becoming the greatest technological achievement in human history. At this point, NASA had the largest budget it would ever see, with approximately 5% of the national budget going to space science. With this budget, on July 16, 1969, at Launch Complex 39 at Kennedy Space Center, Apollo 11 was launched, and on July 20th, touchdown was achieved on the moon. Merely 6 hours after the initial touchdown, Neil Armstrong muttered his famous words on July 21st, 1969 at 9:56 p.m.
"It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
The United States had just successfully landed humans on another planetary body. Over the 12-year mission span from 1961 to 1972, the Apollo program completed 32 successful missions, 3 failures, and landed 7 groups of astronauts on the moon. In a response to these fantastic achievements, the Soviet Union stayed particularly quiet during the United States' space supremacy. This, however, was not without strategy among the Soviets. Headed by Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviets were secretly developing their own lunar programs. These programs moved along in the Soviet space program, and training of Soviet cosmonauts began. Numerous probes, landers, and manned missions were planned for the Soviets to get to the moon, but only the Luna unmanned missions ever made it to the lunar surface. At one point, the Soviets even planned to build a moon base, but that obviously didn't come to fruition. Upon the landing of the Apollo 11 spacecraft, the Soviet lunar program largely dissipated. This led to the end of a fantastic, albeit tension-filled race for space supremacy. That's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this video about the race that led to rapid advancements in technology that made humans a space-going civilization. If you are interested in more videos like this, please be sure to leave a new video idea in a comment, and don't forget to like and subscribe. If you would like to support this channel, please consider going to my Patreon, link in the description below. Until next time, stay curious and go explore.